Well, it's time now here on France 24 for the International Press Review, and for that I'm joined here in the studio by Elena Casas-Montañez. Good morning to you,
Morning again,
Elena.
Catherine.
Now, we're starting off in Syria, where we're continuing to hear about the reported deaths of protesters at the hands of the regime. Now, the Atlantic magazine, I gather you've got an article there, they think it's heading for civil war.
Yes, the article is headlined, "Is Civil War in Syria Inevitable?" And the piece concludes really that it is, if not inevitable, pretty likely. The writer says there's a palpable drift towards sectarian conflict. They report that the Syrian rebels are arming themselves, perhaps with arms from their foreign allies, perhaps with arms bought on the thriving black market in Lebanon. And one opposition leader has explicitly told an Arab newspaper that peaceful protests just aren't working, and they've decided the only thing they can do is launch an armed rebellion. They say that Syria is moving away from the Tunisian and Egyptian model, in which basically a part of the ruling class decided that the best thing to do to ensure their own survival was to decapitate the regime, if you like, and back a democratic transition. They say that the ruling class is too ingrained in Syria, and that in fact the rebels are now going to try and take the Libyan option, that is to say, to launch an armed insurrection. And the Atlantic says it's quite likely that they would get weapons and training from foreign allies, but the country is also divided on sectarian lines. They say there's an Alawite ethnic group that strongly backs the Assad regime, that might well be prepared to defend it to the death, and also a merchant class that's terribly afraid of war and the resulting chaos. So Assad might prove a much more entrenched opponent than Gaddafi.
Although the Alawites is a minority there, majority Sunni,
Yes.
but very interesting analysis there. Certainly a situation we're going to watch here on France 24. But staying in the Middle East now, and more on the deteriorating relations between Turkey and Israel.
Yes, there's an interesting piece in Time magazine on this, which basically blames the US for causing this split, saying that because of the US domestic political situation, in which it's dreadful for any politicians to even criticise Israel, it's really quite taboo. As a result, Washington has no leverage to try and restrain Israel's right-wing government's most right-wing actions, such as refusing to apologise to Turkey for the deaths of those people on the Mavi Marmara. And as a result, Israel has kind of gone off on a limb here, and there's no way Washington can reel it back in. The paper says that the Israeli Palestinian bid for statehood at the UN shows that the US now has no role left as an interlocutor. The Palestinians are ignoring the Americans, and there's nothing they can do really to bring back the diplomatic role they once had, because they've been too partisan.
Okay, interesting. Although the US could, I guess, still put a stop to the Palestinian bid for statehood using their veto at the UN. But apparently, Foreign Policy magazine, you're going to tell us, Palestinians have a plan B.
Yes, as you said, the US is expected to veto that, but Foreign Policy says that's not the end of the UN process necessarily. There's a resolution that dates back to 1950, which the Palestinians could evoke, which says that if one country with a veto is obstructing the UN's aim to promote peace in the world, then they can go around them and go straight to a vote at the General Assembly, which would only require a majority.
Now, we've been looking at 9/11 anniversary, 10th anniversary coming up. That a lot of the printed press, I imagine, has got stories on the legacy of those events too.
Yes, the papers are packed with how it changed world politics over the last decade. Let's look quickly at a piece in the Huffington Post by the left-wing intellectual legend Noam Chomsky. It's an extract from a book he's just written. He says, what would have been the alternative to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, which he said just acted as recruiting tools for al-Qaeda. His alternative theory is that the US should have just treated them as a crime, hunted down the specific suspects who they thought were guilty, and brought them before an international criminal court. He says that approach would have been popular in the Muslim world, instead of creating wars which allowed all sorts of Islamist groups to paint the US as directly opposed to Islam, and as a result recruit opponents from across the Muslim world.
Okay, and just quickly, an article from a US blog, Social Focus. They're taking a different angle now on the decade that shaped by 9/11.
Well, they talk about how it changed individual Americans, and they actually conclude that by bringing world politics strongly back to America, it actually made Americans more open to looking at news from the world outside and realising that America is not an island. Lots of people would take the opposite conclusion, of course, but he says that actually it's resulted in a more informed American public about international affairs, which is good for democracy.
Okay, very interesting take there. Thanks, as ever, Elena Casas-Montañez there with our International Press Review here on France 24.